Counter cards are always a part of card games. If you go back to old school Yu-Gi-Oh, of course you're going to have copies of Dark Hole and Regeki in your deck because you don't know how else to deal with your opponent's Blue Eyes White Dragon. Except when you're looking at counter cards in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it's a little bit different. However, one of the things that I find interesting is whenever there's a weirdly specific counter card printed that in a lot of situations is just completely useless. For example, going back to Regeki, you always know that Regeki is going to destroy your opponent's monsters. Of course, they could have some sort of protection effects, but it doesn't really care what monsters your opponent has. That card versus something like Last Day of Witch, you're going to have a card that's very specific like Last Day of Witch and a card that's not very specific like Regeki, and in most cases Regeki is just going to be better. Of course, you might be saying, well, what if your opponent is playing a spellcaster deck? Well, in that situation, maybe Last Day of Witch actually is a better choice, but when you're thinking of analyzing cards, and this just goes for everything, not just these weirdly specific counter cards, you have to think about, well, is this actually worth a space, a card slot in my deck? Whether or not that's the main deck or the extra deck or the side deck or whatever, is it actually worth putting this card in there instead of other cards? And I know people love talking about these specific counter cards and how powerful they are against certain matchups, but in my opinion, and if we just look at like the competitive history of these type of cards, when you're actually considering playing them, you have to look at a couple different pieces of criteria. For example, these cards must be good against an expected matchup that you are actually planning on playing against at a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament. If you have a bunch of tech options for random rogue decks in your side deck, those probably aren't going to come up very often, if at all. When you're playing these very incredibly specific cards for certain matchups, you want to make sure those matchups are pretty likely to be ones that you're going to play against. You also don't want to play a tech card that you don't actually need against a certain matchup. If a certain deck out there loses to one particular card, that's really cool, but even if that card is good against that deck, if that deck actually isn't very good, that doesn't mean that you have to play that tech option to beat it. Actually, in some of the examples that we're going to talk about in today's video, you'll notice that even though they are technically very powerful against certain strategies or certain cards, if those cards or strategies aren't very good, you don't necessarily need to tech out your side deck just to beat them. But the last piece of criteria is one that I feel a lot of people just don't remember or don't care to remember, and that's that if you are playing something that's very specific, you need to make sure you haven't passed by any better options out there. In the case of something like Last Day of Witch versus Dark Hole and Regeki, picture this: you're playing a deck and the expected meta deck is going to be a spellcaster strategy, and you're like, well, I'll play 3 Last Day of Witch in my side deck. That's broken. I mean, the expected matchup is spellcasters, so why not play these cards? But in that case, what if you just didn't put in Dark Hole or Regeki because you're like, well, those don't kill spellcasters, and even though those cards don't say they kill spellcaster monsters, say they don't destroy spellcaster monsters, they still do in most cases, and they're good against other matchups where Last Day of the Witch maybe wouldn't be so viable. So whenever we're looking at these specific counters, you have to look at all 3 of these things. They're all very, very important. So let's take a look at some good and some bad and some terrible, weirdly specific Yu-Gi-Oh counters. So for the good ones, let's take a look at something that's sort of like Last Day of Witch, but a lot better: System Down. So this is a card that has seen competitive use time and time again, and yeah, it's kind of like Dark Hole, it's kind of like Regeki. It banishes all machine monsters on the field, but also it banishes all of them in the graveyard, and that is extremely beneficial against a ton of decks. This thing saw play against Cosmos, it saw play against ABCs, decks out there that were mostly using machine monsters that you wanted to banish out of your opponent's graveyard. This was especially good at dodging graveyard effects because they never hit the graveyard at all, and this is a card that, while very, very specific, sort of like Last Day of Witch, it actually does have a unique benefit over Regeki and Dark Hole, especially in metagames where you're expected to play against many machine-based decks. Also, it's important to mention, in the case of something like Cosmos, this dodges something like Cosmo Dark Destroyer's protection effect, so if your deck was struggling to deal with Cosmo Dark Destroyer and that was an expected matchup like it was back in 2016, you might want to consider playing System Down in your side deck to better help that matchup. And while not super relevant, System Down actually had another benefit over a card like Last Day of Witch or Dark Hole, and that's that it didn't affect your own field. So if you were playing machine type monsters and your opponent was as well, System Down didn't negatively affect your own combos. What about a specific counter card that's currently seeing a ton of play right now? Artifact LANCEA is a card that is very, very specific, and it's basically a staple 3 of in every single neutral side deck and has been that way for months. Artifact LANCEA prevents either player from banishing cards, and it only really works on your opponent's turn, and yet this card is very, very powerful, and one of the reasons that it's so powerful is because there really isn't another hand trap out there that does quite what it does. It blanket affects both players, and that's a huge deal, but also it's very good against some of the top decks out there, like Orcus, like Thunder Dragons, and even has some unique applications, like when you're going first and you're playing Altergeist and your opponent drops an evenly match, you can discard the Artifact LANCEA because it's on their turn, and then you prevent yourself from having to banish all of your cards. So Artifact LANCEA is a great example of a very specific piece of tech that actually is seeing a ton of play right now. Notice though that Artifact LANCEA isn't always in people's side decks. It's only been the last couple formats. In the past though, when there aren't decks out there that are banishing a lot of cards, or at least not meta decks that are doing that, you don't really see Artifact LANCEA. So for this card to sort of come into the metagame and actually just be completely dominant, it took a lot of things to fall into place. There's no better options, it's good against the expected metagame, and the decks that you're siding it against, you really, really want to draw that Artifact LANCEA. But what about like a medium card? A card that's not terrible, it's not great, it's sort of right in the middle. Well, to me, there are a lot of cards that fall under the category, but one of them is Retort. And this is a card that I think I've talked about a lot in the past. It's a trap card, it's a counter trap card. It says when your opponent activates a spell/trap card with the same name as one in your graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. Then you can add one card with that name from your graveyard to your hand. I will say this, if you get this thing to resolve, especially in a mirror match, which is where you'll probably be playing it, it is insane. You'll probably instantly win the game because you get to negate a card and you get to add one from your graveyard back to the hand with the same name. However, this thing is so specific because not only does it require basically for you and your opponent to be playing the same strategy, you also have to draw a specific spell and trap card that your opponent has to also have in their hand. If you go second, this card isn't very good, but this card has seen some play in very, very refined formats. For example, this card was sometimes played in the Zodiac matchup. You could take your opponent's Barrage or something along those lines, a card that both players are expected to have in many opening turns. Also, this card saw play in the Spellbook mirror where there's tons of different spell cards that you're always playing on the first turn, like Secrets and Judgment and Fate and all those cards, but because of how specific this card is, it's really not that common. Even in refined metagames, you don't always see people playing Retort. It's never been like the most popular side deck option, even in those formats where people are only really playing one or two strategies, but it is a very specific counter that has seen some play, but it is sort of in the middle there. Not super great, not super terrible, just okay, but really good in some situations, which makes it a side deck pick for some players. But what about some specific counter cards that maybe haven't been so good? What do these cards do? What do they do differently than the ones that are actually played? Well, for example, let's talk about Dark Mirror Force. So if you remember, a while back I reviewed every single Mirror Force trap card in the entire game, and in that video I mentioned that Dark Mirror Force isn't very viable, and some people pointed out that you can quote-unquote combo it with Quaking Mirror Force, which is a really bad play, but a lot of other people said, well, hold on, Dark Mirror Force is actually really, really good against super heavy samurai. Why didn't you mention that in the video? Well, I didn't mention that in the video, and no offense to any super heavy samurai players out there, but I didn't feel like it was worth mentioning because no one needs to side specific counters to beat super heavy samurai. I'm not saying that that deck can't get wins. Like, it certainly is capable of winning some duels, but it's not the most popular deck, and it's not the most powerful deck, and it's not the most consistent deck. The idea of having to play a specific counter to beat super heavy samurais is really laughable from a competitive standpoint. More importantly though, even in the weird world where super heavy samurais were like the top strategy, maybe they got some crazy support, is Dark Mirror Force even the best specific counter to them? Wouldn't you rather just play regular effect negation? Picture it this way, I know that these super heavy samurai monsters can attack while in defense mode, so it seems like Dark Mirror Force is a sort of key counter to that deck, but really remember that regular Mirror Force does the same thing, and people don't play that card. I mean, Stormy Mirror Force has seen some experimentation. All the Mirror Force cards aren't terrible, but they're usually not the best option in most competitive metagames. Unless your opponent is running some sort of burn strategy, they're probably going to attack you once or twice throughout the course of a duel to reduce your life points to 0, and yet people don't really play Mirror Force. So why do you think that if super heavy samurai were competitive, people would play Dark Mirror Force just to counter them? But what if we could go even further, even worse, than something like Dark Mirror Force against super heavy samurais? Because at least in that case, it's not not just good against like one specific card, it's kind of okay against an entire archetype. But what if we looked at cards that you could only counter one specific card in the entire game, and we're not talking about things like Prohibition or Mind Crush, because those cards can counter almost anything. You get to choose which card they're counters for. I'm talking about cards that specifically name one individual card, and that is all they counter. Things like Anti-Regeki, things like White Hole. These are the worst of the worst. And I'm not saying that people don't play Regeki and Dark Hole, maybe not so much in 2019, but even when we look at old school Yu-Gi-Oh, when those cards were in the format as well as their counter cards, no one played these counter cards because they were terrible. Having a card in your deck that specifically counters one card in your opponent's deck isn't a very consistent or good strategy. Yes, it might go off every once in a while and that'll be super epic and everyone will say that you're the master for resolving Anti-Regeki, but when you play cards, you don't want to play cards that will win you some games or win one game. You want to play cards that'll win you the most games possible, and Anti-Regeki and White Hole don't do that. They never have done that, and that's why when counter cards like that are printed, they pretty much never see competitive use, even if the cards they're countering are popular. And sure, things like Starlight Road were often used to counter specific cards like Heavy Storm, but Starlight Road has a bunch of applications outside of just Heavy Storm. You could use it on Black Rose Dragon or Torrential Tribute or anything along those lines, so yes, it was used against Heavy Storm a lot, sort of similar to how Anti-Regeki negates Regeki, but it didn't just negate Heavy Storm, it can negate other things that were commonly played as well. Now that we've gone over a bunch of real examples of these specific counter cards, I want to reiterate the criteria that I mentioned at the very beginning so that hopefully you can take that knowledge and use it in your own deck building in the future. So first off, when you play a counter card, it must counter an expected matchup. If a card is good against a random deck that no one's playing, you probably don't need to put that in your side deck. Maybe just keep it in mind for the future, but you don't actually need to play it. The second criteria is that it must be good against a deck that you actually need help against. For example, if you're playing a deck that just happens to have a good matchup against one of the top strategies, even though those top decks are going to be an expected matchup, maybe you don't need to dedicate 8 cards to them. Maybe just dedicate 3 of them because your deck already has a favorable matchup. And then lastly, you don't really need to play these very specific tech options if there are better options available. Sure, it can seem pretty cool to activate Last Day of Witch on your opponent's spellcasters, but does it actually accomplish anything that Dark Hole or Regeki couldn't accomplish? Not really. So when you're thinking of playing these specific counters, especially ones that seem really crazy on paper, maybe just look at other options and say, are these actually better even against the deck that I would be siding these counters for? In that case, those specific counters might be cool, but maybe you don't actually need to play them. Anyway though, thank you so much for watching today's discussion video on these weirdly specific counter cards. I'm sure a lot of people have already done this, but if you haven't, make sure to go to the comment section below and let everyone know what your favorite weirdly specific counter card is. There are a lot of them out there. Personally, I'm a big fan of Rebound, a card that maybe someday will be very competitive, but at least for the time being, it doesn't look like it's going to be that great, and it hasn't been that great pretty much in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh, but I'm still maybe holding out hope for the right deck to come along where Rebound is really, really good. But anyway, I'll see you later. Thank you so much for watching this video. Goodbye.